Snow had fallen for 3 straight days, wrapping the lonely hills in silence so thick that even the trees seemed asleep. Inside her small cabin, Clara Hale listened to the wind moan across the frozen meadow, carrying with it the sound of a world that had forgotten her. She had lived alone since her father passed last spring, the only living soul for miles around these Wyoming peaks. The nights were long, and though she told herself she liked the quiet, the truth was that loneliness crept in like frost under the door. She'd sit by the fire, mending her father's old coat, and pretend someone might one day come down that white trail and knock on her door just to share a warm meal and a few kind words. But no one ever did, until that night. It was just after dusk when the howling began, low at first, then building into a savage chorus that made the hair rise on the back of her neck. Wolves. She'd heard them before, but not this close. Her lantern flickered as she stood, heart pounding, and reached for her father's rifle hanging above the hearth. The cries were desperate, not like a pack on the hunt. No, it was the sound of chaos, of something or someone cornered. She pressed her ear to the frosted window and caught movement between the trees, a dark shape staggering through the snow, the wolves circling, lunging, retreating. It wasn't an animal at all. It was a man. Without thinking, Clara threw on her heavy coat, grabbed the rifle and a lantern, and pushed out into the blizzard. The cold hit her like a wall, stealing her breath, but she kept running toward the sounds of snarling and shouting. The man's voice cracked through the storm, a cry of pain and defiance. When she found him, he was half collapsed against a pine tree, swinging a stick at the circling wolves. His arm bled badly, his coat torn, snow clinging to his dark hair. She didn't hesitate. Raising the rifle, she fired a single shot into the air. The crack split the night, echoing off the mountains, and the wolves scattered like smoke. Clara dropped to her knees beside him. "You're hurt," she gasped, her breath white in the cold. He blinked up at her, eyes hazy with pain but startlingly blue. "Reckon I owe you my life, ma'am," he managed with a weak grin before slumping forward. She caught him, grunting under his weight. He was heavy, solid like the men her father used to trade horses with. "Don't you die on me," she whispered fiercely, looping her arm under his and half dragging him through the snow toward her cabin. The storm was getting worse, the wind biting through her clothes. But she didn't stop until the door shut behind them, and the firelight fell across his bloodied face. Inside, she laid him on the rug near the hearth and hurried to fetch water. His coat was torn to shreds, claw marks deep in his shoulder and ribs. She cleaned the wounds as best she could, hands trembling, whispering soothing nonsense just to fill the silence. When he stirred, she told him her name. "Clara," she said softly. "You're safe now. You just rest." He tried to answer but could only manage a faint smile before sleep took him. Hours later, she sat watching him sleep, the fire crackling low. The storm howled outside, but inside there was warmth, fragile, unexpected. She studied the stranger's face, wondering what kind of man wandered these mountains alone in a storm. His boots were worn, his hands rough, a revolver belt slung low at his hips. A drifter, maybe, or a man running from something. But when she brushed a lock of hair from his forehead, she saw not danger but exhaustion, and something gentle beneath the ruggedness. For the first time in months, she didn't feel quite so alone. As dawn crept gray over the mountains, Clara dozed in her chair, and the stranger woke to the smell of coffee and wood smoke. He watched her for a moment before speaking, his voice low and rough. "Didn't mean to cause you trouble, ma'am." She started awake, embarrassed to be caught watching him. "You nearly got yourself killed," she scolded gently, pouring him a cup. "What were you doing out there?" He hesitated, eyes distant. "Guess I was running from more than just the cold." Then he smiled, a slow, grateful smile that reached his eyes. "Name's Wyatt Kane, and I reckon I owe you more than I can ever pay." She looked away quickly, feeling warmth rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the tracks of wolves and strangers alike. Inside that small cabin, though, 2 souls who had been lost in their own kinds of cold found, at least for the night, a reason to stay warm. For 3 days, the storm refused to break. Snow piled high against the windows until the world outside disappeared in a soft white blur, leaving only the crackle of the fire and the slow, steady sound of Wyatt Kane's breathing to fill the cabin. Clara moved quietly about the room, feeding the flames, drying his clothes by the hearth and keeping watch as he healed. His fever came and went in waves, and more than once she found herself kneeling beside him, whispering soft prayers while dabbing his brow with cool water. "You've come this far, cowboy," she'd murmur. "Don't you quit on me now." When the fever finally broke, it was near midnight. Clara had dozed off by the fire again, her head resting on her folded arms when she felt a hand brush against hers. She looked up to find Wyatt awake, his eyes clear for the first time. "You've been looking after me," he said quietly, voice hoarse from days without speech. "Didn't ask your permission," she teased lightly, smiling despite herself. "You'd have frozen stiff out there." He studied her for a moment, his gaze steady but kind. "Then I reckon I'm glad you didn't wait for asking." There was something about the way he said it, soft, earnest, that made her chest tighten. It had been months since anyone had spoken to her with such warmth. Since her father's passing, she'd built walls of silence around her heart, learning to survive by herself. But this man, this stranger who'd stumbled into her life bleeding and half dead, was somehow thawing those walls without even trying. She turned away, busying herself with the kettle just to steady her hands. "You should eat something," she said, pouring him a cup of broth. "You'll need your strength if you plan to ride again once the snow clears." "Don't know where I'll ride to," he admitted, his eyes following the dancing firelight. "Ain't much waiting for me anywhere." She glanced back at him, curiosity stirring. "No family?" He shook his head slowly. "Lost them long ago. Been drifting from job to job ever since. Guess I got used to empty roads." His voice softened as he looked toward the window. "Funny thing is, I thought I'd learned to like the quiet until I nearly froze in it." Clara smiled faintly. "Quiet can be a cruel companion." Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat neither of them spoke. The fire popped between them, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. It was Wyatt who looked away first, clearing his throat. "Well, Miss Clara, I sure owe you. Don't reckon I can repay what you've done." She shook her head. "You don't owe me a thing. I did what anyone decent would have done." "Don't think just anyone would have faced down a pack of wolves for a stranger," he said with a crooked grin. "You've got courage, ma'am." That grin, it reached his eyes this time, boyish and warm, and Clara felt her heart flutter in a way it hadn't in years. She laughed softly and looked down, pretending to fuss with the blanket over his shoulders. "Courage or foolishness, I'm not sure which," she murmured. But the truth was, his presence had brought life back into her quiet world. The sound of another voice, the sight of another soul moving through her small space, it filled her cabin with something it hadn't held in months: belonging. As the days passed, Wyatt grew stronger. He insisted on helping where he could, even with one arm still bound in a sling. He chopped wood by the door, limping slightly while Clara scolded him for working too soon. "You'll open your wounds again," she said from the doorway, hands on her hips. He grinned up at her, snowflakes caught in his hair. "Can't just lie there while you do all the work?" "Ain't right." She rolled her eyes but couldn't hide her smile. Watching him move about the yard, laughing in the cold air, she realized how much lighter her heart felt with him near. Sometimes, when the nights were long and the wind howled like ghosts across the hills, Wyatt would tell her stories about the ranches he'd ridden for, the horses he'd broken, the canyons he'd slept in under starlight. His voice was deep and calm like the steady rhythm of hooves. She'd listen with her chin resting in her hands, eyes half dreaming. "You make it sound beautiful," she said one night. He chuckled softly. "It was some of it. But even the prettiest trail gets lonely when there's no one riding beside you." That line stayed with her long after he'd fallen asleep by the fire. She lay awake listening to his breathing, watching the shadows play across his face. There was strength in him, yes, but also sadness, the kind born of too many years spent alone. She understood it because she carried the same kind inside her. And somewhere between tending his wounds and sharing quiet laughter over morning coffee, Clara realized something had shifted. The loneliness that had once filled every corner of her days had started to fade, replaced by something softer, warmer, something she was almost afraid to name. On the fifth morning, the storm finally broke. Sunlight spilled across the snow, blindingly white, glinting off every branch and rooftop like scattered diamonds. Wyatt stood at the window, his arm still bandaged but his posture strong again. "Looks like the world finally remembered how to breathe," he said. Clara joined him, her shoulder brushing his. Outside, the world glittered, untouched and new. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He turned toward her then, his gaze gentle and searching. "So's what's inside this cabin," he said quietly. Her breath caught. She didn't know how to answer, so she didn't try. They stood together in silence, sunlight warming their faces, and for the first time in a long while, Clara felt the smallest seed of hope take root in her heart. A hope that maybe, just maybe, the thaw outside was not the only one that had begun. The storm had passed, but the stillness it left behind was almost harder to bear. The snow stretched for miles in every direction, glistening like crushed glass under a pale winter sun. Wyatt's strength had returned. The color was back in his cheeks, and his laughter filled the cabin like a song Clara hadn't realized she'd missed all her life. Yet with each sunrise that painted the mountains pink, a quiet dread grew in her chest because she knew what came next. The snow would soften, the roads would open, and the man she'd nursed back to life would ride away, leaving behind nothing but tracks in the thawing mud. It began with small signs. Wyatt spent more time near the door testing the fit of his old boots, polishing the revolver that hung at his side. He spoke more about the world beyond her valley, the ranches down in Laramie, the wide plains where wild horses still ran free. One morning she found him mending the torn strap on his saddle. "You plan to go soon," she said quietly, though she already knew. He looked up, meeting her eyes with that same softness that had always undone her. "I owe you my life, Clara," he said, "but I can't stay here forever. I'm a man meant for the trail, always have been." She nodded, pretending to busy herself with the fire, though her throat ached with words she couldn't speak. "Of course," she said softly. "A man like you can't be tied down to a little cabin." He smiled faintly, but there was sorrow in his eyes. "Don't say it like that. You've given me more peace these past weeks than I've known in years. But if I stay," he hesitated, his jaw tightening. "If I stay, I'll start wanting things I've no right to want." Her heart stumbled at that. "Like what?" she whispered. He looked away, out toward the snow-bright hills. "Like a home that's mine. A woman's voice in the mornings. The kind of quiet that ain't lonely." The words hung between them, heavy and fragile. Clara turned her gaze toward the window, blinking hard. "Those don't sound like things a man should run from," she said softly. Wyatt let out a slow breath. "They're dangerous dreams for a man who's never learned to keep one." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire, listening to the creak of the wind outside, feeling the ache of something she didn't want to name. Wyatt's bedroll was by the hearth, but he'd fallen asleep sitting up. His hat tipped low over his eyes. In the dim light, his face looked peaceful, almost boyish. She wanted to reach out and touch him just once, but she didn't. Instead, she whispered the words she couldn't tell him while he was awake. "You don't have to go. Not if you don't want to." The next morning, the sky was clear and endless, the kind of blue that promised travel. Wyatt saddled his horse in silence while Clara stood on the porch, her hands gripping the railing tight enough to sting. "You'll need supplies," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. She handed him a small bundle, dried meat, biscuits, a flask of coffee. "You've done enough," he said quietly, taking it from her. "More than I deserved." He swung into the saddle, but for a long moment he didn't move. His breath hung in the cold air like smoke. "Clara," he began, but stopped, as though afraid of what might follow. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You don't owe me any goodbye," she said. "I understand." He stared at her for a long time, the reins loose in his hands. Then finally he tipped his hat, his voice thick. "If the trail ever brings me back this way, you'll have coffee waiting," she finished for him, smiling through the ache. He nodded once and turned his horse toward the valley. The sound of hooves faded into the stillness until it was gone, and only the whisper of melting snow remained. Days passed. Then weeks. Clara tried to fall back into her routines, chopping wood, tending the stove, mending clothes by the fire. But everything felt emptier now. His laughter had filled the walls, and now the silence pressed in heavy as winter. She caught herself listening for footsteps that never came. At night she'd dream of wolves, of snow, of strong hands reaching out from the dark. She missed him in ways she didn't know how to name. Not just his voice or his smile, but the way he had looked at her like she was something worth finding again. Spring crept slowly into the valley. The creek thawed and the first shoots of green began to push through the snow. Life returned to the land, but not to her heart. Then one evening, as the sun sank behind the pines, she heard it, the distant rhythm of hooves on the hardening earth. At first she thought she was imagining it, but the sound grew louder, closer. She stepped out onto the porch, her heart pounding. Down the trail came a horse and rider, dark against the fading light. The rider dismounted halfway up the path, walking the rest of the way as if unsure he'd be welcome. When he reached the fence, she saw his face, wind-burned, tired, but smiling that same slow smile she'd dreamed of. "Couldn't get far," Wyatt said, voice rough with emotion. "Every mile I rode, the wind just kept whispering your name." Clara covered her mouth, tears spilling freely now. "You came back," she breathed. He nodded, stepping closer. "Tried not to. Tried real hard. But I reckon some places don't let go easy." The world around them was still. Only the sound of the creek and the soft flutter of the wind through thawing branches. When he reached her, he took her hand in his calloused one. "You said once quiet can be cruel," he murmured. "You were right. But with you, quiet feels like home." And before she could find words, Wyatt leaned down and kissed her, slow and reverent, like a man finally letting himself rest. The snow was melting, yes, but in that moment, it felt like spring had come all at once. Wyatt never spoke much about what made him come back, and Clara never asked. Some things didn't need words. The day he returned, the sun had just slipped behind the ridge, painting the snow with a pale gold light, and when he stepped through her doorway again, it felt as if the long, lonely winter finally loosened its hold on her soul. He set down his hat, looked around the little cabin that had once been his shelter, and smiled as though seeing it for the first time. "Reckon it feels warmer in here than I remember," he said softly. "Maybe it's just the fire," Clara teased, though her voice trembled. "Or maybe it's because you finally stopped running," he said, his gaze steady on her. From that evening forward, Wyatt became part of the rhythm of her days. They moved around each other easily, as though they'd been doing it for years, sharing chores, laughter, and long silences that didn't hurt anymore. He patched the roof, mended the fence, and carved small things with his pocket knife when the evenings grew long. Clara would sit by the hearth sewing or baking bread, pretending not to watch him, though she always did. There was something deeply peaceful in the way he filled the space. Not loud, not restless, just present. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed the sound of another person breathing nearby. As the snow melted, the valley came alive again. Birds returned, the creek ran clear and cold, and the hills turned green beneath the sun. Wyatt repaired the old barn behind the cabin, saying she ought to have a horse again. "A woman out here alone should never have to walk the ridge road," he said, though they both knew she wasn't alone anymore. One morning he rode down to the trading post and came back leading a chestnut mare, gentle-eyed and sure-footed. "She's yours," he said, placing the reins in Clara's hands. "For saving a man who didn't deserve it." Clara touched the horse's muzzle and looked up at him with a shy smile. "You make it sound like I rescued more than one lost soul that night." Wyatt's grin softened. "Maybe you did." In the evenings after supper, they'd sit on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the stars prick through the dark. The air smelled of pine and thawed earth. Sometimes Wyatt would hum low tunes under his breath, old cowboy songs that rose and fell like the wind. Clara would close her eyes and let the sound wash over her. Once she said quietly, "I used to be afraid of the dark." He glanced at her. "Ain't afraid anymore?" She shook her head, smiling faintly. "Not since you came back." He didn't say anything, just reached over and took her hand, rough palm against her softer one, and held it until the night grew still around them. But even peace has its shadows. Some days she'd catch Wyatt staring off toward the horizon, his eyes distant. "You miss the trail," she said once, not accusing, just curious. He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Sometimes. The road gets into a man's bones. But what I miss most is the man I used to be when I still believed there was something worth riding toward." He looked at her then, his voice quiet. "Guess I found it here." Her heart ached with tenderness. "You've given me something too," she said softly. "I was fading, Wyatt. You brought me back to life." The spring stretched sweet and slow. They planted a small garden behind the cabin, carrots, beans, and wild herbs. Wyatt teased her that she'd grow enough to feed half the valley, and she teased him that he'd eat it all before harvest. Their laughter carried across the meadow like birdsong. On rainy days, he'd read aloud from her father's old Bible, his deep voice steady as thunder outside. When lightning flashed, she'd draw closer and he'd rest a hand over hers, grounding her with quiet strength. There was never any rush between them, no declarations or grand gestures, only the quiet certainty of two people who had already chosen each other in the simplest, truest way. By midsummer, the cabin had become something more than shelter. It was home. Wyatt built a small corral for the mare and started training a young colt he'd found wandering near the ridge. Figured he could use a second chance, he said with a smile. Clara only nodded, understanding. Every time she looked at him, working with the horse, humming softly to himself, sunlight catching in his hair, she saw a man who had finally laid down his burdens. And maybe, she thought, he was her second chance too. One evening, as the day faded to gold, Clara stood by the fence watching him work. He came to her after putting the horse away, wiping his hands on his trousers. "You've been quiet tonight," he said gently. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated, eyes fixed on the horizon where the last light lingered. "Just thinking how strange it is," she said. "All my life I thought I'd spend my days alone. I made peace with it. But then a storm brought a stranger to my door, and now I can't imagine this place without you." Wyatt smiled and stepped closer. "Wasn't the storm that brought me here, Clara," he murmured. "It was you." He reached out, brushing a stray curl from her cheek, his fingers lingering just long enough to make her heart stumble. "You think you saved me from those wolves, but truth is, you've been saving me every day since." Clara's breath caught as she looked up into his eyes, seeing in them all the things neither had dared to say aloud. "And you've been saving me too," she whispered. Then, for the first time, she leaned forward and kissed him, softly, tenderly, with the kind of love that asks for nothing but time. The world around them fell away, the scent of pine, the hum of crickets, the golden hush of dusk. It was just them, two hearts that had learned to beat together again after too long in the cold. When they finally pulled apart, Wyatt rested his forehead against hers and smiled. "Guess we're both fools," he said. "Maybe so," Clara replied, her voice trembling with joy. "But it feels like the best kind of foolish there is." The summer sun had warmed the valley, turning every patch of earth into gold and green. Yet Clara sometimes found herself staring at the distant ridge where snow still clung to the peaks. The storm seemed far away now, almost like a dream. But she never forgot the night she'd found Wyatt half frozen beneath those same mountains. It had been half a year since then, and every day since he'd become a little more rooted in her world. He belonged in her kitchen, laughing as he burned the biscuits, belonged out by the barn, his shirt sleeves rolled up, hammering new boards in the sun. Sometimes she wondered if he realized just how much of him had become part of the rhythm of her life. But that peace was tested one afternoon when riders came down from the ridge. 3 of them, rough men, trail-dusted and hard-eyed. Clara was in the yard hanging laundry when she saw them, her stomach tightening as their horses kicked up dust along the road. Wyatt was splitting logs nearby. He dropped his axe the instant he saw her face. "Go inside," he said quietly, his voice changing. Low, calm, but edged with something she hadn't heard in months. She obeyed, watching from the doorway as the strangers reined up near the fence. The one in front, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his jaw, spat into the dirt. "Wyatt Kane," he said, his tone half a sneer. "Didn't think we'd find you hiding behind a woman's skirts." Clara's blood ran cold. Wyatt didn't move. "Ain't looking for trouble, Mason," he said evenly. "You found it anyhow," the man replied, dismounting. "You walked off with money that wasn't yours, and my boss don't forget a debt." Clara's heart pounded. She'd known Wyatt carried secrets, pieces of a past he never spoke about, but hearing them dragged into daylight still hurt. "Whatever I took, I'll pay it back," Wyatt said. "You'll pay with more than coin," Mason growled, drawing his revolver. Clara stepped forward then before she could think, her voice sharp and shaking. "Leave him be." "He's done nothing to you." Mason laughed cruelly. "Well, ain't that sweet?" The little homestead angel sticking up for her stray dog. Before he could raise the gun, Wyatt moved. The next few seconds were a blur of motion. Wyatt diving for cover, the crack of gunfire splitting the air, a horse rearing. Clara screamed, the sound lost in the chaos. When the dust settled, one rider was down. Mason was bleeding from the shoulder, and Wyatt stood, his gun smoking, his arm grazed but steady. "Get off my land," he said, his voice like thunder. Mason glared, clutching his wound. "This ain't over," he hissed before spurring his horse and galloping off with the others. Clara ran to Wyatt the moment they were gone, tears spilling as she pressed a hand to his arm. "You're hurt," she cried. He caught her trembling hands, pulling her close. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Just a scratch." Don't you ever scare me like that again, she whispered fiercely, her face buried against his chest. I thought I was going to lose you. Wyatt held her tighter, his voice rough. You won't, not ever again. He lifted her chin and kissed her, desperate, fierce, full of the promise he couldn't speak any other way. That night, as he cleaned his wound by the fire, Clara sat beside him in silence. You don't have to explain, she said softly. I know you've done things you regret. So have I. He looked at her, surprise flickering across his face. You've done nothing wrong in your life. She smiled faintly. I let myself believe I didn't deserve anything more than loneliness. That's its own kind of sin. Wyatt reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. Then I guess we're both forgiven now. In the weeks that followed, the valley seemed to breathe easier again. The riders never returned. The world settled back into its gentle rhythm, mornings filled with sunlight and laughter, nights wrapped in quiet warmth. Wyatt finished the barn, built a new table from pine, and carved their initials into the beam above the door. So if some wanderer ever finds this place, he said, smiling, they'll know it belonged to two fools who got lucky. Clara laughed, but when she looked up at the carving, tears glimmered in her eyes. Not luck, she said softly. Grace. Autumn came early that year, crisp and bright. The air smelled of apples and pine smoke. One evening, as the sky turned silver with the first hint of snow, Wyatt took her hand and led her outside. You remember that night you found me? He asked. Every moment, she said. He smiled, his breath clouding in the cold. You said I was safe now. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. You made me safe, Clara. You gave me a home. He knelt then, pulling a small silver ring from his pocket. Simple, worn, the kind a man keeps for years until he finds the right hand for it. I ain't a rich man and I don't have much to give, but I can promise this. Wherever I am, my heart's yours. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks as she whispered, You already gave it to me, the night I saved your life. Wyatt's eyes softened. No, darling, you saved my heart. And as the first snowflakes of winter drifted down around them, Clara nodded and said yes. They married quietly by the creek a week later, just the two of them and the wide, endless sky. The mountains watched in silence, the wind carrying their vows through the pines. When it was done, Wyatt kissed her long and sure and said against her lips, Guess the wolves didn't get me after all. Clara laughed, her tears shining like morning frost. No, she said, but one of them stole my heart anyway. Years later, when travelers passed through the valley, they spoke of a little cabin by the creek where smoke curled gently from the chimney even in the coldest storms. They said a man with a kind smile lived there with his wife, and sometimes, if the wind was right, you could hear her laughter echoing through the snow. And though the world moved on and seasons changed, the cabin stood, a quiet testament to two hearts that had once been lost in winter and had found, in each other, their forever spring.